Good afternoon. I'm so happy to have all my fifth graders back with us today. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Let's get started. Again, we will start with our word work. Again, we're using our combined knowledge of our letter sounds, our correspondences, our syllabication patterns, and morphology to read accurately unfamiliar multisyllabic words in context and out of context. We're going to work with it in context a little bit today. And our essential question again is, how can I figure out a new word by breaking it down into parts? A little review for you. We did this two lessons ago. Aster. What did it mean? Do you remember? Yes, it means star. Very good. What were some words maybe with aster? Astronaut, astrology. Very good. How about this one? Spec. What did it mean? What was its meaning? It's the correspondence. Yes, it meant look. Okay, can you remember? Remember the old-fashioned word for glasses? What is it? Spectacles. Good job. Good job. What about this word? Mal. Do you remember what it meant? Okay, yes, it means bad. And we used it with malware, which is that awful stuff that crashes your computers. Our last lesson, we talked about graph. What did graph mean? It meant written. Very good. Like a paragraph or an autograph. Okay? Speaking of auto, that's our next root. Auto, what did it mean? Self. Like in an autobiography, I wrote it myself. Or my automobile, it's self-moving. I'm not Fred Flintstone. I don't get out there and run. Tract. What did it mean? Yes, it meant to drag or to pull. And we talked about with attraction, how Cinderella's palace pulls people in to Disney World. Or like my tractor, how I can plow. I drag that plow behind it, or I drag the hay baler behind it. Okay? Now, let's look at some new ones. Okay, so if the root celer means fast, what does accelerate mean? Here are our choices: to increase speed or to oppose action. So let's think for a minute. If celer means fast, which one of these two choices maybe means fast? Well, if I increase, which means going up, my speed, that means what? I'm going faster. So maybe if I oppose an action, that means I'm going to stop it. I don't want it. So our answer choice would be yes, to increase the speed. Let's look at it in a sentence. The race car driver accelerates around the first turn. Now, what does that mean? If he accelerates to go around the first turn, that means he's going to go faster. Very good. Let's look at another one. If the root grat means pleasing, then gratuity must mean, okay, grat means pleasing. Pleasing is something that's good, that makes you happy. All right, we have study of the Earth's surface, or we have a tip, token of appreciation. Well, I think the Earth's surface is pleasing, yeah, but we learned that study of something was ology, right? So we know that can't possibly be it, and we learned that geo was land, so that we know that can't be it. What about appreciation? What do we know about appreciation? If I appreciate something, yes, I am pleased with it. I am happy. So gratuity must mean a tip. You're tipping somebody because you're pleased with something. Let's look at it in a sentence. Some restaurants have an automatic gratuity for parties of 8 or more, meaning that the tip is already added onto the check. Okay? Let's look at another one. So, if the root soph means wise, then philosopher must mean, okay, it's got to have something to do with wise. Let's look at our choices. Standing, steady, and firm. Well, that might be wise. It depends on where you are. My answer choice has the word wise in it. So, a wise person. And we know from our past studies that E-R or O-R usually means a person who does something. So this would be a person who is wise. Yes, good job. Let's look at it in a sentence. The philosopher Socrates once said, "There's only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance." I tend to agree with that. Knowledge is good. Ignorance not so good. Okay? One more. Maybe two more. Two more. All right? If the root lumen means light, then illuminate must mean, okay, light. To fill with light? Well, maybe, because we have light in our choice, but it's never good to pick your first choice. It's always good to see what all our choices are. To name a number of items on a list. Well, our sentence tells us light, and our answer choice has light. I would assume that illuminate would mean to fill with light. Good job. Or I would have an educated guess. Let's look at it in a sentence. The spotlight will illuminate the entertainer so that everyone in the audience will be able to see her. So can you picture that in your mind of a spotlight on somebody on stage? They're illuminating the stage. Good job. If the root opt means best, then optimum must mean to speak or declare something clearly. Well, I hope that's your best when you do that. Or the best something could be. Well, you have best in your answer choice. You have best in your sentences telling you what it means. So, the best something could be. Let's look at it in a sentence. The home theater offers optimum comfort with a captivating surround sound experience. So, it's the best comfort in the home theater. Good job. Now, our objective in reading. We're going to analyze multiple accounts of the same event or topic, noting important similarities and differences in the point of view they represent. And again, how does the author's point of view and purpose shape and direct the text? And I promised you that, well, let's go to this. First-hand account. What does it mean for a first-hand account? First-hand account is based on the author's personal experiences. In social studies, we call these primary sources, okay? That means that they were the person who experienced, who was there, who it happened to, okay? And it's told by somebody who was actually there. Examples, if we're going to look at something, because we were not there in 1776, nobody alive was. So we have to look at diaries of people who were there, or their journals, or maybe somebody wrote their own biography, so an autobiography, or even letters that were written back and forth to spouses or family members or whatever, or even you could look at photographs, okay? Those are first-hand accounts of things that happened. Second-hand account. Well, if first-hand was actually there, second-hand probably was not. So it's going to be based on an author's research, what they found out about a topic. If they looked into the American Revolution and studied the photographs or studied the journals and then they wrote something about it, this would be the second-hand account. And it's told by somebody who learned about the event, by someone who was there. Now, I can't talk to anyone who was there during the Revolutionary War, but I can read their journals or their diaries. They were there, okay? So they're telling me what happened even though they're not with us anymore, okay? Examples of this, encyclopedias. I know y'all don't use those a lot. Y'all would rather use Google. But encyclopedias or biographies or textbooks or interviews, okay? So, the American Revolution. Now, I want us to look at this book, or a piece of this book, an excerpt of this book, as we learned in the beginning of when I first started. George versus George, The American Revolution as Seen from Both Sides by Rosalind Schnauzer, okay? George versus George, do you know what I'm saying? The two Georges? George Washington and King George, okay? So we have George Washington, and he was born February 22nd, 1732. He died December 11th, 1799. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and he was the first president of the United States, okay? King George was born June 4th, 1738, died January 29th, 1820. He was the King of England and the rest of the British Empire. So it's not just England, but all the British Empire. And at this time, there was a lot of it, which included the American colonies. There were once two enemies who were both named George. George Washington was the man who freed the American colonies from the British. And George III was the British king who lost them. Big difference right there. One became president, one lost them. Okay? Was King George a royal brute? Well, American patriots said so, but others held him as the father of the people. Others liked him. Others thought he was doing great. Was George Washington a traitor? Was he a traitor because he was, in the beginning, a British citizen? So was he a traitor to the king? The king's supporters thought so, but many celebrated Washington as the father of his country. Who was right? There are two sides to every story. And that lots of people agree with that. Lots of people even say there are three sides to every story. Your side, my side, and the truth. And a lot of times when we talk about perspective, the truth generally falls somewhere in between. Okay? So I'm going to read to give us some background knowledge of the American Revolution before we look at some others of their perspective. So what stirred up the hornet's nest in the first place? It all began over money and over the rights of citizens too. Great Britain had been in one war or another for 50 years and was drowning in debt. They owed a lot of people money. Over in London, Parliament, which is their style of government, decided that Americans should help out by paying their fair share. King George agreed. Sounds kind of reasonable. After all, Great Britain had spent plenty of money fighting in America for the good of the colonies. The Crown was still supporting a British army to help stop Indian attacks on the American frontier. It was Great Britain's right to collect payment. To raise the money, Parliament passed a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act, saying the colonists had to pay taxes to Great Britain for all support of imported goods, from molasses, blue indigo dye, and pimentos to printed items, such as marriage license, playing cards, and newspapers. Similar taxes were often collected in England, but the colonists were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts. And to run the colonies, a lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. Besides, they believed it was against the British Constitution. Now remember, the colonists were British citizens. Ever since the Middle Ages, English law had said that there should be no taxation without representation. So that's not something new that the colonists were saying. This has been the way. This meant that citizens could never be taxed unless their elected representatives voted to pay. The colonists were British citizens, and the law guaranteed them the rights of Englishmen. So where was their right to have representation who could vote for or against those taxes? Though many colonists would say loyal to the Crown and obey its law no matter what, others argued that Parliament might make them pay even more taxes without their consent. Many colonial merchants refused to buy British goods. Pamphlet writers roared. Preachers thundered from their pulpits. Angry members of an organization called the Sons of Liberty stripped royal officers holders and covered them with hot tar and goose feathers. They used to tar and feather folks in Great Britain, too, at this time. A mob completely wrecked the home of the royal governor of Massachusetts. A straw dummy dressed to look like a stamp distributor was hung from a 120-year-old elm tree, and the British tax stamps that Americans were supposed to buy were burned in every colony. By the time the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect, in November of 1765, flags were being flown at half-mast to mourn the death of liberty. Nobody in America would even distribute the stamps. 4 months later, hoping to restore peace, Parliament finally gave up and got rid of the hated taxes. This troubled King George, who still thought the taxes were fair, but he signed the repeal anyway. British merchants were delighted to get their lost customers back, and all of America celebrated. Well, the story could have ended right there, but of course it didn't. To show they weren't afraid to tax the colonies, Parliament started demanding even more taxes. Patriot leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia made polite protest to the king, but politeness didn't help one bit. King George believed that God gave noblemen the divine right to rule and that the colonists had a duty to obey. The British stubbornly informed legislatures in both colonies that they couldn't have any more meetings. So the colonists stopped trying to be polite. The Virginians, including George Washington, met anyway and banned the sale of all items taxed by Great Britain. Colonists smuggled in untaxed goods from other countries, which was illegal, and they made lots of their own goods instead of buying British ones. A women's group called the Daughters of Liberty supported the cause by weaving their own cloth, making their own ball gowns, and brewing their own Liberty tea out of sassafras flowers. King George was sure that certain gentlemen who pretended to be patriots in Massachusetts were no more than criminals. So he sent a fleet of warships to Boston to make them behave. 700 soldiers wearing fancy uniforms soon paraded up Boston streets with muskets on their shoulders. Whenever they went off duty, many stole, drank too much, and chased women. Some infuriated worshipers by purposely racing horses, beating drums, and gambling under the church windows on Sundays. In March 1770, an angry mob of American rowdies started taunting 8 of King George's soldiers and pelting them with icy snowballs. Then someone threw a lump of wood at a redcoat and knocked him flat. The enraged troops began firing into the crowd. Five colonists were killed. Furious Sons of Liberty were quick to label this disaster the Boston Massacre, and it stirred up plenty of anger on both sides. Okay? So, was this a first-hand or a second-hand account? And how did you know what I just read? Was that first-hand? Was that coming from somebody who was there? Or was it coming from somebody who had done research? Yes, it was second-hand. And how did you know? Well, it sounded like it was written from someone who had done research about the topic, not someone who had actually witnessed all these events. It didn't say that I refused to pay this, or I refused to buy the British goods, or I made my own cloth and I made my own ball gowns. It didn't say that I smuggled in goods. It was talking in third person, that they did this and they did that. So that also helps us. But where might you find, I found it in this book, George versus George, but where might you find it? Where else could you find it? Do you think if you Googled about the American Revolution, you might find this there? Yeah, it's probably in an encyclopedia or something like that. So let's look at 2 perspectives. The British perspective and the American perspective, okay? Stories being told can be interesting, especially if one telling the story have lived the story. Boston was a busy city back in the day and still is. I saw many people with red coats on. It frightened me. The soldiers from England talked often about their king. I had never seen this king that they spoke of often. My father spoke often about liberty and independence. It made me wonder why it was so important to him. He had told his silversmith in town, Paul Revere, that he did not want to be ruled by England anymore. Paul agreed. Because of his feelings, I found out that Paul Revere had persuaded my father to join the Sons of Liberty. John, who was my friend from my schoolhouse, disclosed to me that people in this group talked often about separating from England and forming their own country. My father didn't hear me listening into his bedroom, but I hear him talking to my mother often about how he did not have enough money for the taxes that the British were forcing him to pay. What made me sad was hearing him cry about how he wanted to feel freedom for the first time. Independence is necessary for my happiness, he told his friend. Being a young boy during the time, I would often play with my shiny militia toys and would pretend that I was fighting with them. It helped me understand that I was seeing around me. I also had a toy horse and a horseman that I would pretend to run throughout the cities of Lexington and Concord, warning colonists that the redcoats were coming and to bear arms. I would tell the colonists to have their guns ready in case they needed to protect their property. One night late in the evening, I could not believe what I was hearing. I heard ferocious horses galloping down my street. I heard a voice that sounded like Mr. Revere screaming at the top of his lungs. "The redcoats are coming." I was startled. I fell out of my bed and ran to my father's bedroom. He told me to go deep into the cellar and wait until he gave me further instructions. I didn't realize it then, but a revolution had begun. Who's the narrator of that story? Yes, it was a young boy. Was he a colonist or was he British? He was a colonist. Is this a first-hand or a second-hand story? It's a first-hand account. And how does it be in first-hand account? How does it help you understand? Well, it helps you understand the feelings of the American colonists during this time. He wanted freedom. He didn't want to be under the king's rule. Let's see here. We have just a few minutes, so let's read this real quick. These ungrateful colonists need to be thankful. I was in Boston the other day. I heard colonists call me a lobsterback. How rude. I came from my beloved England to protect these people. Why would they call me a lobsterback? I wonder why the king even bothers with this place. I saw a drawing on the streets the other day. It was by a man named Paul Revere. It was mocking my precious king. The drawing of the toad with my king's face on it was disrespectful. On Wednesday, I had snowballs thrown at me, and I believe that they had hard rocks in them. I'm so tired of hearing them gripe. They complain openly about paying taxes. Do they not realize that taxes are a fact of life? You are guaranteed 3 things in life: birth, death, and taxes. They have to pay taxes so that they have streets to ride on. You have to pay taxes so that you have water to drink. They complain that they have no representation in the government in England. They couldn't be more wrong. All they need to do is hop on a ship and vote when we vote. Silversmiths like Paul Revere make plenty of money. What a little bit more for England. Colonists are so concerned with becoming independent from England that they're blind to the fact that we protect them from Indian attacks. We bring the colonists goods. Only England can provide goods like tea and ink. Do they not know that their precious tea that they drink costs money? It costs money to transport it over the ocean. Be thankful that we do what we do. Be thankful that we have a king that loves us. Be thankful that he knows exactly what we all go through. It makes me angry that I have to keep dealing with disrespect. I am sure that there's going to be a war between England and the colonists. The colonists are like whiny little children. They need to be punished. Who's the narrator? British soldier. First or second hand? First hand. How did you know, and how does it help you understand? It helps you understand the feelings of the British soldier and the British citizens during the early stages of the Revolution. They could not understand why the colonists did not want to pay for the king's protection. That's all we have time for today. Please come back Thursday where we'll talk a little more about perspective and 2 different accounts. Have a great afternoon.